Hello, St. George's friends. I'm coming to you today from 935 West Quilly Street, which is less than a mile from our beautiful church at St. George's. And my goal today is to provide a little bit of insight into a couple of the people who are behind the recognition levels that are part of our 157-year campaign. And also to say thank you to those who have already entered into their commitments to this campaign, and also to those who are still contemplating a gift to the church. I want to start with my story and how I became involved with this hole in the ground that I'm standing in. I do a lot of mountain biking and a lot of outdoor stuff, as some of the other friends of mine do in the Griffin area. And about 20 years ago, we were contacted by Spalding County that they had been donated this piece of land, and the idea of putting in some multi-use trails, primarily for hiking and mountain biking. And fast forward another 18 years, when the project finally began to get some momentum and get off the ground, I and a group of volunteers began the process of establishing the trail system out here. And over the course of those next many months, as we worked on the trails, the question kept coming up commonly about, what is this place? Does anybody know what this was ever used for? And was it truly an active quarry? And so I began to think, that would be worthy information for me to know, as much time as I'm spending out here. So I contacted the archivist for the city of Griffin, Cindy Barton, and her response to me when I asked her if she had any information related to the old quarry up in Experiment, she said, well, I have one newspaper article from 1888 that came from the Griffin Daily News, and she said, are you familiar with St. George's Church? And I said, well, I happen to be. Is there a connection? And she says, let me send you the article. And it was in that article that I learned that the land that I stand on today by these rock walls is the very stone that was quarried to build our church 157 years ago. So I want to talk a little bit about that connection to St. George's, but also talk about what happened to the quarry after the stone was quarried out of here for St. George's, and the purpose of that 1888 newspaper article. That article highlighted the fact that at that point, the Central of Georgia Railroad had acquired this land, and they used this quarry for the next likely 40 to 50 years to quarry aggregate that went into many of the rail beds for the rail lines that surround this area. So what that did for me, learning that story about how this stone went into the building of our church, it created a truly tangible connection to me and this ground that we worked on, and that's the reason that I still continue to be actively involved out here as a volunteer. So the first of our honorees that I want to talk about is Dr. George Beecher. The Beecher Society is that level of those that have committed to our campaign, the amount of $5,000 or greater. Dr. Beecher was born in 1833 in Milledgeville, Georgia, at the time that Milledgeville was actually the capital of the state of Georgia. He was born into a prominent family. His father was named Samuel Beecher, and he was very active in the Whig Party. You all may know the Whig Party was the party that was involved in initially the independence of our country and our separation from England. Well, Sam owned the historic States Rights Hotel in Milledgeville, which is exactly what you would think it would be. It was a meeting place for all the prominent politicians of the day. Well, Dr. Beecher went on to be a part of the Phillips Legion Cavalry of the Confederate Army, and at some point relocated to Griffin, Georgia. We're not sure what sort of doctor Dr. Beecher was. He's referenced as Dr. Beecher in a lot of the literature. Don't know if he was a medical doctor, if he was a PhD, or maybe he was just a self-anointed doctor. We really don't know that about Dr. Beecher. But he did acquire this 150 acres, roughly, that we sit in here today in Experiment, and was a member of the Episcopal congregation that had been meeting in Griffin for some time at that point, but didn't have a permanent church home. So in 1867, conversation started about the possibility of building a permanent sanctuary for the Episcopal worshipers in the community. And Dr. Beecher was a part of that initial building committee. He knew that his farm had a considerable amount of exposed granite on it, and offered up his farm to be used to mill the stone that would eventually develop the foundation and the exterior walls of our church. I laugh a little bit when we hear about Dr. Beecher's farm, because if you spend much time up here, you realize there's more exposed granite than there is really tillable soil. So I question what it was that Dr. Beecher was actually able to farm here, but I'm certainly grateful that he offered up this stone in this quarry for our church. Today, this quarry is a central focus of something known as Quarry's Edge Park. It includes over 6 miles of multi-use trails. It's used for hiking, mountain biking, and nature study. I invite you to visit sometime, enjoy these surroundings, but most importantly, offer a moment of gratitude to Dr. Beecher for his generous donation. So we've moved to the eastern edge of the quarry pit now, likely to the area that the railroad used when they were extracting stone from the pit and turning it into the aggregate that went into the railroad beds. They possibly then transported it from here by light rail to the existing train line that we all know that runs along Experiment Street. Very little is known about the techniques that were used to not only quarry the stone, but also shape it into the stone that we know and we see as we look at our lovely church building. We do know one thing: it was very likely all done by hand, and we also know that it was very likely moved by mule wagon from this location a little over a mile back to the church. Not only do we not have certainty as to the process of how they pulled the stone from the quarry or how they transported it to North 10th Street, we also don't know exactly what techniques they used to hoist these heavy stones from the ground to the highest reaches of the church. We can only assume, too, that that was done by some sort of manual block and tackle system. Whether that system was hoisted by manpower or horsepower or a mule power, obviously we do not know that, but we can rest assured I do not believe there was any motor-powered mechanization to that. So again, as you stare at the church, not only think about the generous contribution that Dr. Beecher made when he offered up the stone that formed our foundation and formed the walls of our church, but also take a minute to think about the fortitude, the hard work, and the ingenuity that went into building such a beautiful place that we have at St. George's that has now lasted 157 years. So we've moved again. Now we're at Block 1 of historic Oak Hill Cemetery here in Griffin, and we're standing at the grave sites of Caleb Dow and his wife, Alora. Caleb Dow is the second person that we wanted to recognize or honor as a part of the 157-year campaign. Reverend Dow was the rector at what we now know as St. George's Episcopal Church, but was simply an Episcopal parish in Griffin at the time when they began to contemplate the construction of our sanctuary. Unfortunately, Laura died shortly thereafter in 1873. But the stone which surrounds the burial plot was quarried from the same pit on Dr. Beecher's farm as what went into the building of the church. Reverend Dow later passed away on October 29, 1890, and was buried next to Mrs. Dow. St. George's enjoys a long and prosperous history. It may well have not been possible but for the generosity of Dr. George Beecher and the spiritual leadership of Reverend Dow. We are fortunate that 157 years later, we can still see their handprints on our church home.